the rich think, the poor also think. So one common denominator between the rich and the poor is that they both think. So just like the rich engages their minds in thoughts, the poor also engages their minds in thoughts. So it's a common denominator between the poor and the rich. The difference here is that the way the poor thinks about the same thing the rich think of is different. So the poor and the rich think of similar things but in different ways. Let me say that again. The poor and the rich, they actually think of similar things, but they think of those things in a different way. For instance, the poor thinks of housing for himself and his family. The rich also thinks of housing for himself and his family. The poor thinks of feeding for himself and his family. The rich also thinks of feeding and food. The poor thinks of education for children. The rich likewise does that. The rich also thinks of how to take care of children education. The poor thinks of business. The poor thinks of business and investment. The rich also does that. But how the poor and the rich think of these things is quite different, and this is what brings the demarcation between the rich and the poor in terms of wealth creation. Now let's look at a more in-depth analysis of how the poor and the rich think with respect to some of these things that I have just mentioned. Now let's take food and feeding for example. Okay, so the poor thinks of how to buy less. The poor is thinking of how to buy in small quantities. The poor actually buys in bits. So he's thinking of how to buy in small quantities, and his aim or his goal or his mindset is that he wants to save money by buying less. So the mindset of the poor is to buy in bits so as not to spend more or not to spend much. So his ideology is that by spending less, he's actually saving more. Okay? Whereas the rich, when they think of food and feeding, they are thinking of buying in bulk. So the rich buys in large quantities. Why does he buy in large quantities or in bulk? His mindset is that by buying more, he's saving more. So he buys more to save more. So over time, by buying in larger quantities, he's actually cutting down on the cost of buying those things in bits. So if you compare what the rich buys in bulk at a particular period of time to that of what the poor does by buying in bits over a period of time, you eventually see that the rich is actually smarter and more financially intelligent when it comes to that, because over time the rich will save much more than the poor who buys in bits and is actually spending much more to buy less quantity than what the rich actually does. Now, another good example to analyze the difference between the way the rich thinks and that of the poor is when it comes to children education. So like I said earlier, the rich and the poor all think of educating their children, sending their children to schools and all that. Now for the poor, their basic aim is let my child go to school just like every other child. So the first thing that comes to the mind of the poor when it comes to children education is affordability, is price. So when a parent, for instance, when a poor parent wants to enroll a child in a school, let's say a primary school or a secondary school, the first thing he wants to know is how much is the school fees. So he's concerned about price because of affordability. On the other hand, the rich is looking beyond fees. He's looking at other things that he perceives as very important to him. He's looking at the environment of the school. He's looking at the caliber of parents whose children also attend the school. He's looking at the environment where the school is located. He's looking at what are the extracurricular activities that that school engages in apart from the regular school work. So he's looking at all these factors and he's less concerned about the fees. Why? Because he believes he can afford it and he is more interested in certain other details which the poor is actually overlooking and just focuses on how much is the fees. So these examples clearly show us that the poor and the rich think of similar things, but they think of these things quite differently. Now, because of how the rich thinks, because of how the poor also thinks, this actually goes a long way in determining what they buy and where they buy from. So the rich buys from certain places which the poor choose not to buy from. Basic reason is price, affordability, durability. So for the poor, he's thinking of cheap stuff. So he goes to places where things are sold cheap. He's less concerned about quality, he's less concerned about durability. His focus is on price, and because his focus is on price, he goes to places where cheap stuff is sold. Now, on the other hand, the rich is thinking about quality and durability. The rich is focused. When he wants to buy things, he's thinking of quality, he's thinking of durability. So he goes to places where he perceives that quality stuff and things that are durable are sold. So you see that the mindset of the rich compared to the mindset of the poor determines their actions with respect to so many things that they actually do.